Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. It's been a busy 24 hours here at UnHerd. Our interview with Vice President JD Vance, conducted by our US editor Sohrab Ahmari, has travelled across the world. In fact, according to the Daily Telegraph, it has moved markets and moved currencies. They describe the interview this morning as FTSE surges, that's the share index here in London, as JD Vance eyes great UK-US trade deal. The Guardian had it top of their website as well. JD Vance says US hopeful of a great trade deal. The Times of London, JD Vance, US-UK trade deal likely as Trump loves Britain. Some people took a slightly different note from the interview. Politico, JD Vance, Europe can't be a permanent security vassal of the US. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. BBC News, top of that homepage most of the morning as well. Good chance of US-UK trade deal. Financial Times, Sky News, even our friends at the New York Times. Not always enthusiastic linkers to UnHerd. Pretty much lead with the same headline. JD Vance predicts Trump will make trade deal with the UK. Reuters, I could go on, but you get the idea. It's been all over the world's media. No one prior to this video or podcast, if you're listening on podcast form, has actually heard the interview. So what we're going to do is I'm going to bring Sohrab onto the channel now.
Hi, Freddie. Good to see you.
I should say Sohrab has not had a lot of sleep overnight. We keep interrupting his night doing hits with BBC Today programme, Sky News. Basically, the headline that everyone has seized on is that the Vice President was very optimistic or sounded very bullish about the chances of a UK-US trade deal. And obviously here in Britain, that is a near obsession. So that is top of all of the bulletins. But there were other things in your conversation that you had with him just 2 days ago that I think we should kind of unpick a bit, because I think we learned quite a lot. The first section that you went into with him was about Zelensky and Ukraine. Tell us about what you thought he was saying.
The reason I asked that first is because the day before it was leading headlines here in the United States, because President Zelensky had appeared on the U.S. television program 60 Minutes and, among other things, said that he believes Vice President Vance is, quote, somehow justifying Vladimir Putin's actions. And so I asked him, how do you react to that? And do you think that's a productive way for the Kiev government to engage with the Trump administration? And he started by saying, no, it's absolutely not a productive way to engage. What he was trying to do is say that not just the United States, but that the Trump administration condemns the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. He especially kind of emphasized the full-scale invasion. At the same time, because the president was elected on a course to bring peace to the conflict, that the U.S. policymakers at the highest levels have to try to understand what each side's red lines are and how they see the battlefield and what they think they're going to get out of future negotiations. And that talking or thinking in this way is not tantamount to apologetics for Vladimir Putin.
Let's have a listen to what JD Vance actually said. And I should say, because it's a telephone line and the quality isn't very good, we've tried to enhance it as much as we can. It makes it sound a bit weird, but you can pretty much make out what he's saying.
I've repeatedly condemned the full-scale invasion that was launched in 2022, but like President Trump, I've also tried to apply strategic recognition that if you want to end a conflict, you have to try to understand where both the Ukrainians and the Russians see their strategic objectives. That doesn't mean you morally support the Russian cause or that you support the full-scale invasion, but you do have to try to understand, what are their strategic red lines, in the same way you have to try to understand what the Ukrainians are trying to get out of the conflict so that you can negotiate a peace. And that's what the president has been doing for a few months now. And I think it's sort of absurd for Zelensky to tell the government, which is currently holding his entire government and war effort together, that we are somehow, sort of on the side of the Russians. As the president said, we're not on anybody's side, we're on America's side, but we happen to believe that America's best interest is served through peace.
So that little section there, to me, in a sense, is trying to soften. It's conciliatory in that he's emphasizing that he condemned the invasion. But the flip side of it is really quite resolute, isn't it? It sounds very determined that he's annoyed with Zelensky for these comments. He says they were unproductive. He sounds a little bit short-tempered, perhaps, about what's going on in that region. And the final note, we're not on anybody's side, we're on America's side, is just a really bald restatement of the principle of America first.
He could have been much harsher on President Zelensky, reacting to his comments in which he was portrayed as a Kremlin apologist. Considering how harsh the tone was in that Oval Office encounter, that famous or infamous Oval Office encounter, compared to that, calling it not productive. Of course, he does say later on that it's absurd, given the fact that Ukraine's war effort hangs on American support. It's absurd to characterize the Trump administration as being on Russia's side. But so that's the first thing to note, is that it maybe just the anger is dialed down just a little bit from where it was in the Oval Office. But other than that, I mean, I think what you get is actually the same substantive worldview, more or less. It's just couched in somewhat warmer tones than European leaders have been accustomed to receiving.
Yeah,
from the
and when
president.
you're vice president and your words literally move markets, differences in tone make a big difference. And the passage we're now going to quote, which is where he's talking about how much he loves Europe, he loves the European people. He feels that the Anglo culture, which connects both the UK and the United States, runs very deep. That whole section, I feel, is really a new departure for him, because some people were expecting that the role JD Vance would play in this administration as the intellectual, the man of letters, the much decorated writer, he would have a sort of explaining role, a softening role, to try to make the Trump policies more acceptable to the chattering classes. Well, that's not what's happened at all. In fact, JD Vance seems to be playing much more of a kind of attack dog role within the administration. But here we're hearing a little bit of diplomacy. Let's have a listen.
I love Europe. I love European people. I've said repeatedly that I think that you can't separate American culture from European culture. We're very much a product of things, philosophies, theologies, and of course the migration patterns that came from Europe that launched the United States of America. And so I love the people there. I love the different cultures. I certainly think Europe has a lot to offer the world.
I mean, in a sense, it's boilerplate saying some nice things about Europe to patch things up, but it seems to have worked, because European newspapers are currently leading with those remarks. Everyone is feeling quite insecure, and it seems to have had an impact. What was your takeaway from it?
When you said he's the attack dog, that is actually typically the role of the vice presidential nominee during the campaign. So in any given campaign, the presidential nominee should be a little bit aloof and not so getting into the sort of gritty fights of the campaign, but the vice president gets in there and attacks the other side. And so it's interesting in a way that JD Vance has maintained part of the attack dog role, maybe perhaps more so than other predecessors that I'm trying to think of. Certainly his, immediate Republican predecessor, Mike Pence. JD is a statesman intellectual. He is the person who will have read that New York Times essay that everyone is talking about that weekend. If you know your typical American politician, like a member of Congress, trying to engage with them and as an intellectual, for the most part, is really painful, but not so with JD. However, he also, I think, has, and I didn't put this in the piece, but I think he has, Jacksonian America. He's an Appalachian. It's Jacksonian country. And Jacksonianism is obviously a movement in American history, but it's also a kind of sensibility of a combination of distrust of elites, rugged individualism. Part of that, I think, is a kind of scorn for the old world as a place that's associated with, underhanded intrigue and kind of highfalutin ideas and so on and so forth, but that don't connect with what ordinary Americans are like. And that, I think some of that has come out of his earlier statements about and to Europeans. It doesn't here. Here he's reminding us, he's a Catholic convert, Christianity.
Yeah, he mentions theology there. You wouldn't necessarily have that word in most politicians' descriptions of the affinity between Europe and America, the theology.
the theologies. Yes, absolutely. So he's striking a different note. And as you say, he's reminding us that he's capable of code switching. He can speak at different registers. It can be the kind of Jacksonian, I'm here to tell you, Brussels suits that you're all wrong and you're suppressing free
Populist.
speech. Yeah, populist. Or he can remind you that he actually, knows his St. Augustine,
That tension is really core to the JD Vance conundrum, isn't it? Because he is, as you say, he is the man of letters. He is the intellectual, more so probably than anyone else sitting around the cabinet table. And yet his whole story, his whole identity is just absolutely, it comes from the Appalachian Mountains around Ohio. He feels, he talks about how it's a nation, not an idea. His ancestors that were building things that came down from the hills and created those factories, they are the core of the American story. There's a sort of deep affinity with a kind of working class history. The story of Hillbilly Elegy is all about that tension. And what we're almost seeing is that tension inside him playing out now as geopolitics, because markets move depending on which of those two identities is dominant in JD Vance on a particular day.
Another tension is between the kind of solidarity-oriented New Dealer mentality that he has when it comes to economic issues, which parts ways from the GOP's traditional free market bootstrapping ideology. At the same time, there's the other side of him who is a venture capitalist.
The Peter Thiel side.
The Peter Thiel techno-libertarian side. He sees the figure of Mama, that's his grandmother who raised him, that Mama on the one hand was a New Dealer. She liked her unions. She liked her, Social Security benefits and Medicare and stuff like that. And at the same time, she had this revulsion for indolence, for people who, took benefits without kind of deserving them or working for them. And those two are in his mind at the same time, in some ways personified in this kind of spirit of Mama. That's another axis of kind of tension within Vance that's more has to do with U.S. domestic policy as it's taking shape under the second Trump administration.
Let's turn to foreign policy, because a lot of this conversation was about Europe. And really, JD Vance raised two things. You asked what his attitude to Europe was. He gave us that little love letter, which has excited everybody so much. But really, he was clear that there are two big issues. And the first, what he led with, was not defense spending, as you might expect. In fact, it's immigration. Let's have a listen to what he said.
I think the first is, we are very frustrated. We, meaning me, the president, certainly the administration, that European populations keep on, frankly, crying out for more sensible economic and migration policies. And the leaders of Europe keep on going through these elections and keep on offering the people of Europe the opposite of what they seem to voted for. And that's something I really worry about, is that the entire democratic project of the West sort of falls apart when the people keep on asking for less migration and they keep on being rewarded by their leaders with more migration. And obviously, I think there's an economic component to that. I think there's a cultural component to that. But I think most importantly, voters have the right to decide what they want. And I think that, I say this as a friend, not as, a person who's pointing fingers and saying, you guys are screwing this up, but as a person who really respects and loves Europe, that part of actually, I think, surviving and thriving in the 21st century is to be responsive to the will of the people on the migration question. That's something that, frankly, American leaders and European leaders have screwed up for close to a half a century. And I'm sort of saying, look, just as President Trump has taken the concerns of voters seriously, we encourage our friends in Europe to take the concerns seriously.
So what strikes me about that is it's really an internal European question. So I wonder whether there's a little bit of a tension here about if you are all about national sovereignty and staying out of European affairs, why are you so exercised by their migration policy?
How I would put it is that at the same time as, there's a kind of inward-looking quality to the whole Trump project and America First, I think Vance especially, but the Trumpian cohort as a whole, see themselves in a cohort with national populist movements across the developed world or across the democratic West. The ability of those parties to be able to break through the various cordons sanitaires that the mainstream left and right typically erect around populist parties is something that, maybe they see, the Trumpians see as affecting them, right? Like they would like to be able to deal with politicians across the Atlantic and maybe across the Pacific as well, who understand their language. They basically represent the same kind of voter oftentimes, which is so interesting, like
it's the conservative international. People used to talk about the socialist international, which was this sort of camaraderie between left-leaning politicians. Something is now happening a bit like that on the right.
Having lived in Britain, I know there's such an analogy between people from deindustrialized areas in the north of England and people from the American Rust Belt. Like so many they would immediately get along if you put two kind of stereotypes of the two together in a room. They would get along. And so they would like to see governments that think like them. And as it is, with kind of the migration issue is one where migration might just be a kind of lightning rod for this problem, is that not everywhere, but oftentimes the mainstream parties of the center left and center right, legally, there's no conspiracy to it, are very good at bandwagoning together, sort of circling the wagons and preventing insurgent populists from affecting their will. Even if they might have a great deal of, if not majority, they might have plurality support for their agendas.
It's very interesting. So actually, JD Vance, and I think Elon Musk as well, who has been very active in inserting himself in European internal politics, more so perhaps than JD Vance. He appeared at the AfD political rally on a big video screen. He's been talking about other right populist leaders around Europe. He's been very engaged with the Reform UK party here in the UK. And so there is this sense that while half the time we are criticizing them for being isolationist, in fact, the other aspect, which might be troubling or inspiring to people, is that the Trump team see themselves as kind of team captains globally for a right populist international movement. They want to actively encourage it across Europe and elsewhere, it seems. And this to me read like, okay, I know that this UnHerd interview is going to be read in Europe. I'm going to do a bit of a shout out for my right populist friends across that continent and do what I can to give them some support.
If they have their way, the result won't be internationalism, obviously. It would be a strange kind of internationalism because each of these parties in some ways see their own countries as being diverted from the path that it should go down by kind of US-led institutions and US-created kind of EU architectures. And so it's funny. It's like an international of people who want nationalism.
Yeah, and that's going to hit some roadblocks. As we've already seen in Canada, Pierre Poilievre was kind of enthusiastic about Trump a while ago and now is extremely negative about him because they're in the middle of an election. It doesn't play very well to be seen to be teaming up with the American right. Even Nigel Farage here in the UK, who's made a huge amount of play about his friendship with Donald Trump, is really much more careful these days around that. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Let's move on to the second of his European critiques. It's more the traditional one that we've heard so much about, that there's insufficient spending on European defense. But where I thought it was interesting and new is that he talked about Charles de Gaulle. He talked about this idea that European independence was more than just a practical security matter that would relieve the United States from having to pay for it. It was actually an ideological goal for him, that to have a strong, independent Europe might actually act as a brake on American missteps, which is a kind of amazing thing to hear from the sitting vice president of the United States. But he talked about history, how he believes in the Suez Crisis in the 1950s, the Brits were right and the Americans were wrong. And of course, the Iraq War, which is a very important part of his own ideological journey, was another example where Europeans, the Germans most vocally, were very resistant to going into Iraq. But eventually they were defeated by George W. Bush and Tony Blair and that alliance. So he's saying this very surprising and striking thing, which is he would like Europe to be stronger and more independent from the United States, precisely because it might help push back against the United States?
Well, I definitely think that America and Europe will continue to thrive with the economic and security relationships of our two separate, continents. But no, I don't think that Europe being more independent is a threat to the United States. In fact, I see it as good for the United States. Mm-hmm. Just going back through history, I think, frankly, the British and the French were probably right in their disagreements with Eisenhower about the Suez Canal. Mm-hmm. Something I know a little bit more personally, I think that a lot of European nations were right about our invasion of Iraq. And yes. Frankly, if the Europeans had been a little bit more independent and a little bit more willing to stand up, then I think we could have saved the entire world from the strategic disaster that was the American-led invasion of Iraq. So I actually think that a more independent Europe, yes, it's going to lead to sort of, more conversations, sometimes even more debates. But in the same way that, I don't think that Americans in the 50s, 60s, and 70s ever asked themselves whether France was a real ally. There were, of course, disagreements, but I think it's okay for allies to have disagreements, and that's exactly what I want Europe to be. I want it to be an ally. I want it to be an independent, strong ally. Obviously, each individual country to be independent, strong allies. I don't want the Europeans to just do whatever the Americans tell them to do. I don't think it's in their interest. I don't think it's in our interest either.
If we lived in a calmer news environment, the fact that a sitting vice president of the United States says that in the Suez crisis, Britain and France were in the right and the Eisenhower administration was in the wrong would be a pretty earth-shattering event. But the fact is that because of so many other things going on, this is like the kind of number 4 or 5 item that the European media has noticed about this interview. Because 1956, especially in the minds of the American foreign policy establishment, left and right, the kind of what the populists call the bipartisan uniparty of hawks and interventionists. 1956 is a proud moment. Why? Because it represents the final kind of full eclipsing of British imperial power by American primacy. It's when British primacy gives way to something kind of more robust, which is American hegemony. So for an American president to say maybe that was not such a triumphant moment because it created a Europe that wasn't able to think for itself, that was a vassal, as the vice president repeatedly said in this interview, that Europe has become a military vassal. Under other conditions, that would be a really big deal.
Just to point out, it's maybe even more specifically interesting than you say, because to resurrect the Suez crisis as a live issue is really an extension of the controversy JD Vance was arguing about on Signal that was leaked, which is whether Americans should be paying to keep the sea lanes open coming into the Suez Gulf. This is the same question. The Suez crisis was all about, is it the British and French responsibility to worry about the Suez Canal, so much so that they could do invasions of Egypt and military maneuvers to secure that area? Or is it basically the Americans who are now in charge via the UN? And that was the big shift in 1956. What JD Vance seems to be saying here is that he wants to reverse it all the way back to pre-1956 and say a strong UK, a strong France, returning to a almost spheres of influence way of understanding the world, where they have empires that look after their own vital interests in their region, and America wants to withdraw. It's an incredibly striking thing for him to say.
I have to say, from the point of view of his voters, that of the people who elected President Trump and Vice President Vance, that would totally resonate with, huge majorities. The fact is, I think that he would say that it's not that I want to go back to a world of spheres of influence that more resembles, the 19th century than it did the 20th century with its kind of bipolar and then eventually unipolar arrangement. It's that we're already, whether the United States or France or Britain likes it or not, we're already heading into a kind of multipolar world, in part because the United States just doesn't, in terms of absolute power, it's still the top dog, but in terms of relative power, with rising powers, most notably China looming, it doesn't have the kind of muscle to police everywhere in the world all the time. And the last thing I'll say, knowing how America has handled the Middle East and comparing it to British diplomacy at its zenith, Americans are just, we're not good. I'm Middle Eastern, so it's kind of odd for me to say but Americans are just not good at that kind of supple diplomacy that a region like the Middle East takes.
Let's move on to the next section of your conversation with the Vice President, in which you talk about trade deals, specifically the possibility of a trade deal with the UK. Once again, this is an obsession in this country. It has been ever since Brexit, because in 2016, when we voted just about to divorce from the European Union, the main benefit was supposed to be this amazing trade deal we were going to get with the United States. It became like a meme, almost like a totemic. And of course, it didn't happen. Everyone has been talking about this for years. So now a few positive remarks from the Vice President in your interview, again, have made front pages across the country. Let's have a listen to what he said.
So we're certainly working very hard with Keir Starmer's government. And you're right, the president really does love the United Kingdom. He loves the Queen. He admires and loves the King. It is a very important relationship. Of course, he's a businessman and has a number of business relationships in Europe, but I think it's much deeper than that. There is a real cultural affinity. And of course, fundamentally, America is an Anglo country. We come from that Anglo world. Our legal system, our culture and values is very much an offshoot of what was going on in the British Isles for hundreds and thousands of years. We are working very hard on a trade deal with the Starmer government. I don't want to prejudge it, but yes, I think there's a good chance that we're going to come to a great agreement that's in the best interest of both countries.
So once again here, do we face a bit of a contradiction or a conundrum? Because here at UnHerd, today, we are running a piece by a famous farming writer who is appalled at the idea of a trade deal with the United States, because it's going to be the famous chlorinated chicken that is going to come. Whatever happens, don't eat chlorinated chicken. That's going to be coming to our shores. But really, it's a populist defense. It's a populist case he's making. He's saying these are our ancient lands. This is the way we farm. We have our standards. We have our history. We don't want a trade deal with a distant power that is going to come and suddenly flood our markets and distort our markets with their produce. Frankly, it's just the sort of thing that JD Vance might have written or said if it was the other way around. So it is kind of interesting that here he is saying there's a good chance that, yes, we'll come to a great agreement that's in the best interest of both countries. JD Vance is now a free trader.
Well, I don't know if he's a free trader. I think in the whole mentality of the Trump administration, the idea that there might be a universal tariff is pretty hard set. And as you know, there's been a kind of rescinding of the more punitive penalties or a suspension of them, but the 10% minimum remains. And so from Vice President Vance's point of view, or the Trump administration's view, a great trade deal might still include some tariffs on Britain and maybe some reciprocal ones on the United States from the British side. Although in response to the interview, I should say, Sarah Jones, the UK Industries Minister, did respond to this interview, and she said, well, it's very positive that he's positive, and we don't like tariffs. No one likes tariffs. And I thought, well, I don't know. I didn't speak to any details. Obviously he's not the U.S. trade representative getting in there in a granular way, going across tables of products and so on. He's just speaking at a high level. The universal 10% is something that they hold very dear. Or maybe that's another contradiction that, as they make trade deals, they walk that back, that even the 10%.
You asked him this really important question, which is, as the financial markets have been all over the place in the past couple of weeks, since so-called Liberation Day, with rescinding of tariffs, putting on new tariffs, everyone seems to be confused as to exactly what the end state is going to be. One question that has not been clear is, what is the metric of success? What is the point of this for the administration? I haven't felt that was very clearly communicated by them. You asked him straight out, and this was the answer he gave.
We certainly recognize that, we want to rebalance global trade. Other countries are going to respond. We're going to have to respond to that. We want to do something in the markets respond. We have to respond to that. We're very cognizant of the fact that we live in a complicated world where nobody else's decisions are static, but the fundamental goal of the policy is to rebalance global trade And I think the president's been very clear on that and very consistent in that.
So by rebalance global trade, what he means specifically is that exports would be closer to imports. Success looks like, in all of these bilateral relationships, the delta, the gap between the amount that the United States imports and exports getting smaller. That's he's said it there. So we can actually measure it. We can see in 4 years' time whether there's been any positive progress on this. He's kind of set his own test for success there.
I interviewed a very senior Trump administration official the day the Liberation Day happened. That person was very, very close to the process of designing the tariffs. And, honestly, it was still the same answer, that the main problem as they see it is large, persistent, and growing trade deficits. Now, it's notable that Vice President Vance in this interview said, look, there are product categories in which you kind of have to expect trade deficits, right? So, for example, the United States doesn't grow bananas. Like, if we want bananas, we're going to have to import them, and that means there's going to be a trade imbalance. Likewise, with entire smaller countries, it might be the case that the relationship is one that's characterized by deficits. He said that. Looking at it globally, where constantly America's trade deficit continues to grow everywhere, and lots of other countries use the U.S.'s home market as a kind of sponge for their own surplus product, that's something that they want to tackle. Now, we'll see whether that's successful, but it's like, I think we did a public service in this regard with this interview just by clarifying, in a very decisive way, as you said, what metric it is that the administration itself is going to judge its own performance on.
Let's end with the final section of your conversation when you asked him about his habits on social media. There's been quite a lot of focus on the fact that the vice president, who you would expect to be very busy doing a lot of things, which I'm sure he is, manages to find the time to spend quite a lot of time on X, formerly known as Twitter. He recently got into a spat with a podcaster called Rory Stewart here in the UK, not someone who you might necessarily think was at the level of the vice president worth worrying overly about, but he took the time to do that. Obviously, he enjoys it. What was his answer? Let's get a listen first.
There are many blessings to this job. One unquestioned downside is that I very much live in a bubble. I'm surrounded by Secret Service agents. It's very hard for a stranger to walk up to me in public. In fact, it's damn near impossible.
Yes.
And so, I see social media as a useful, albeit an imperfect tool to stay in touch with what's going on in the country at large. And there are a lot of other things that I try to do to stay in touch to make sure that the bubble of the vice presidency doesn't make it impossible, for me to hear the concerns of the people that I serve. I probably spend way less time on Twitter than I did 6 months ago. That's probably good for me, but I've got to try really hard to stay connected because the White House, the West Wing, the vice presidency is sort of by design a bubble. And I think to be a good vice president, I have to step outside of that bubble as much as I can.
So he's connecting to X to get out of his bubble. That's what the vice president told you.
Correct. That, his job is such that he's surrounded by Secret Service agents all the time. And he said, ordinary people can't, it's damn near impossible for them to walk up to me, but I need to know what's going on in the country at large. And so that means one way to do that, he said it's not the only way, but one important way to do that is social media. I gotta say, as someone who himself is accused of being quote unquote very online or too online, this is the one where I'm most sort of, inclined to, just outright defend the vice president, just because I think it can be very refreshing. Someone who writes for UnHerd named Zaid Jalani might criticize some aspect of Trump's immigration policy, and the vice president will come in and say, well, and he often gives long, thoughtful answers, even as on other instances, he can be quite pugilistic. And that was the case years ago, even while he was just running for his Senate seat in Ohio. He adopted an ever more kind of pugilistic persona on X, but some of those engagements, actually the Rory Stewart one, on the one hand, you're right. It's a little bit odd it's like sort of to come down from those Olympian heights and argue with a UK podcaster. On the other hand, that's where he actually showcased this really deep grasp of Christian theology of, whom do I owe duties of solidarity to? Is it just to everyone, or do I have to first focus on the home, the country, the patria? And he used this Augustinian concept of the orders of love. You know, your orders of love are kind of these concentric circles. We've just never had anything like this of the second most powerful man in the world who gets in it and sometimes is very rough on Twitter as he is in person, and rhetorically he can be pretty brutal. But then at other times he can like argue Augustine with a podcaster.
I've heard people put other understandings of Augustine on the table in response to that. I think his understanding of the Ordo Amoris as a defense of only looking after your own people, some Christians would take against. But I think we'll have to leave that for another.
I'm not defending every little thing on the substance. I'm just saying the form of a vice president who's willing to do that and engage with ideas even as he is making serious decisions is not necessarily bad. The other side of it is that, like, could social media become its own bubble?
To which the answer is yes. It obviously definitely is its own bubble, right?
Yes.
So you talked about talking to the ordinary people on the street. You talked about real people. These are not the kind of characters he's engaging with on Twitter. They're either intellectuals like Rory Stewart and Zaid Jilani, or they are these kind of right-wing meme accounts that are putting forward, I would say, pretty distorted versions of reality that there are indications that JD Vance believes to be true in a way that is a little bit concerning, I would say.
The danger that the right faces, and this is not just Vice President Vance, but the right as a whole, is to be too keyed into what like Anons think and trying to please them at the expense of the majority who might have very different views. This was actually the problem of the left of a few years ago. I mean, the reason in part the left, lost the 2024 election and is now just so unpopular is because lots of politicians really mistook what was happening on these social media platforms for popular opinion, so that it was okay to say defund police. That's a risk that he has to confront.
How online should they be? And is this maybe the most online administration in history? I would say probably yes, it is.
It probably is,
and Sohrab Ahmari, our very own US editor, thank you for doing that deep dive with us into exactly what the Vice President told you yesterday. You've been awake for a long time. I think we better let you go and have some sleep.
Thanks, Freddie.